back with the program. Fresh from a press conference where he has unveiled his 8-point plan is U.S. Senate candidate Eric Hovde. Hey, Eric, how are you?
Fantastic. How you doing, Vicki?
I'm doing well. So we're going to go over your 8-point plan here. It's great to have you back on the program. But before we do that, Eric Hovde, I'm just going to throw 3 articles that hit the news today. I'm just going to throw them all at you at once. Number one.
Sure.
Our interest payments on the national debt over the next 10 years equal $4.2 trillion.
Yeah, let's get scarier, though. Right now, our Defense Department is the largest expenditure at $710 billion. Our interest payments are $454 billion, but we're financing our debt at the lowest cost ever. So if our interest payments go up 1% on $16 trillion in debt, that's another $160 billion. If we go up to a normal 5%, where we've averaged financing our debt over the last 5 years, our interest payments go over $1 trillion. You take that number and then you multiply that, it's scary.
A year?
Yeah.
So you are using the yearly numbers.
Yeah,
that's $420 billion a year. If interest payments go up 1%, if our interest rates go up 1%, that's another $160 billion a year. If it goes up 5%, that's $1 trillion more dollars a year. That's interest. That's just debt service.
You can't cut your way out of it. That's the problem. That's why the economic studies have shown that once you get your debt to your economy of over 90%, if it stays there for more than 3 years, you're almost in a death trap. That's why I got into this whole race.
All right, the other number I'm going to throw at you is since 2007, the average household wealth has declined 40%. And also since 2007, government at the state level has grown 14%. At the federal level, it has grown 33%. Our personal wealth has been wiped out. Our interest rates and our debt are to the point where, over 10 years, it's larger than the U.S. economy. And if the interest rates go up, it's worse. And government is growing, acting as if there is no such thing as a recession.
Yeah, the only people that are getting wealthy or doing well are in government. I think you had only one person in the Department of Transportation making $170,000 a year, just going back 4 years ago, and now under President Obama, you have 1,700 employees just at the Department of Transportation making over $170,000. Go look at what President Obama's done for raises for all the people in his White House. One, you'll say, why do we even have a position for some of these spots? But, people are getting 50, 60, 70% pay increases. It's insanity. And as you know, Vicki, that's the whole reason I'm in this race. I never was planning to get out of my private sector life until I saw that our government is heading us right off a financial cliff. And what's so scary about it is these people have so little economic sense that they can't see what's happening in Spain, what's happening in Italy, what's happening in Greece. Spain has a 24% unemployment rate. For those that are 25 and under, their unemployment rate is 54%. The economy is in complete free fall, and it's getting worse every single month. Greece, the same thing. Italy's starting to blow up. It's all because they took on too much debt and government choking the private sector with regulations, bad tax policies, all the rest.
All right, and that's why, it's one thing to have government spending balloon, but what we've seen happen, you mentioned Europe, but also in the United States, is that the government sector itself stopped the productive sector from being productive. Threw a wet blanket over the private economy here in the United States. We still don't know if those Bush tax policies are going to be extended. You've got no reason to expect this economy to grow in any significant way to even help mitigate the impact of that debt.
Yeah, look, the numbers are very clear. We are growing at half the rate that we normally do out of a recession, half the rate. Our unemployment rate has gone up. We're at 8.2%, but as I've talked about with you before, if you factor in people that have just given up looking for a job, or part-time labor that wants a full-time job. They call it the U6 data from the Labor Department. We're at 14.8%. This economy is stumbling, and all this president has done is send us closer and quicker off a financial cliff. So, it's insanity. I always am confused why people think President Obama's smart. I have always thought this guy's an economic, moron, to be blunt, and he doesn't understand the most basic elements of economics.
I think that's true. I actually think he's economically ignorant.
Yeah.
Because it doesn't make sense to pile on regulation. We actually saw regulation increase in the United States by somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think it was 180 brand new regulations per month we saw in the first 2 years of the Obama administration. So part of your plan is tax reform. Part of your plan is dealing with the Federal Reserve. Part of your plan is regulation. Let's start with regulation.
Sure. It's estimated by a study that regulations are costing the private sector over $1.5 trillion. Think of how mind-blowing that is. We have 81,000 pages of regulations. So think of how many regulations are on a page, and we have 81,000 pages of regulations. The first thing that President Reagan did, which a lot of people may forget, in 81 was he tasked all his cabinet secretaries and undersecretaries to go get deregulation pushed through. And it unleashed the private sector and allowed the economy to grow enormously. It is one of the critical things we have to do. In fact, Gallup polled small businesses and said, what are your biggest impediments? 46% of small businesses said they were not hiring any more employees because of excessive regulations. I mean, it's so clear. And this president just keeps adding more and more and more.
And not the least of which is Obamacare, which is scaring the holy living, out of small business, particularly small and medium-sized business. And, I mean, you've got 46% of saying, look, we got hiring on hold just simply because of the red tape and the cost of compliance with government. That's $1.5 trillion a year taken out of the private sector economy that could be used for all kinds of different productive behaviors.
Oh, absolutely. And let's talk about Obamacare. It's one of my points of my 8-point plan. You got to repeal it. You got to replace it. I don't understand. Over the last 30 years, the highest rate of inflation of any sector in our economy is health care. The second is higher education. What is the similarity between the two? Massive government involvement. Over the last 30 years, federal government's role in our health care industry has grown to 60%. It is soon going to be the largest sector in our economy. Why do we want to all of a sudden centralize and have the control being driven out of Washington, D.C., when they don't know how to manage anything? I think we need to move totally in the opposite direction, give people choice, let them be smart consumers, and for those that are struggling economically, provide premium support. I think the direction this president is taking us is a disaster, and by the way, how they crafted Obamacare is a complete fraud and lie when it comes to economics. They said that it's going to actually save money over the next 10 years, and what they did is they factored in 10 years' worth of revenue, but only 6.5 years of expenses. If I did that with a public company, I would be thrown in jail.
They factored in 10 years of revenue and 6 years of expenses, but they also didn't factor in the fact that revenue was also, when they called it revenue, those were tax increases. And that actually has a detrimental effect on the economy itself, like those 46% of businesses who said they don't want to hire due to regulation. So they weren't even being honest about what that revenue actually would have cost the economy. It would have been, if this is allowed to be implemented, and the Supreme Court will come down with its decision soon, it is an unmitigated disaster for businesses in this country. But so that regulation, you can't see it. That's the problem, Eric. Nobody sees it, and so no one pays attention to it, and you don't realize that from the nickel and dime regulations at secondhand shops to the massive regulations like Obamacare, we're bleeding the productive sector dry, all the while massively expanding the actual percentage of government as a percentage of GDP. And when you include our debt, we're over 100%.
Yeah. Well, let me give you just a personal example of what I've had to deal with government regulations. I own community banks. It's my main business. One of my community banks, we bought some failed banks, and you have to account for how you're buying these problem assets on the bank's books. We hired Navigant, a big international firm who works with the FDIC, tell us how to do it. They did it, and an examiner comes in and says, Why are you doing it that way? I don't like that. You got to do it totally different. And, you got to hire another firm. So we hired another firm, McGladrey, spent money, and finally came and said, you got to do everything different. We did everything different. It cost us about $1.5 million, $1.6 million. 2 years later, another examiner from the FDIC shows up and says, why did you do this that way? And we're like, what do you mean? It's your former examiner told us to come in and do it. He said, no, this is all wrong. We said, what do you mean it's all wrong? He said, you should have done it this way. Well, that's the way we originally did it. And, here I went through sacrificing my people's time, energy, working over weekends. We spent $1.5 million on outside consultants, all to do it because one examiner said to do it a different way than we originally did, and another examiner shows up 2 years later and says, no, you did it right the first way. And what did I get from the FDIC? I didn't even get an apology.
But you did get a bill. You did get a bill for $1.6 million. Eric, I got to take a break, so stick around after the break here. I got to pay some bills, so we'll be back with more. Eric Hovde, I just love picking his brain on stuff as well, but he happens to be running for U.S. Senate, and he just unveiled his plan at a press conference for those of you who got a chance to see that. We'll be right back. Welcome back. I got Eric Hovde for another break here, and he was just talking about regulation and the inanity of this bureaucratic nightmare that is this regulatory blanket that sucks $1.5 trillion in the aggregate out of the U.S. economy every single year. I mean, some of you are familiar with that EPA case in Idaho where a couple was incurring $30,000 a day fines because the EPA had them in a catch-22, finally had to go to the Supreme Court. Individuals can get hammered by regulation. Businesses get hammered. Eric was just talking about how he got put through a regulatory ringer and it cost him $1.6 million. That's something we really got to seriously look at, Eric, and I'm not sure how you do it, but, I suppose you start by, just looking at anything that hasn't been used maybe in the last 10 years and get rid of it.
Yeah, well, when President Reagan tasked his people to go out there and do it, and my father was one of them, I remember my dad slapping 2 books down in front of a congressional hearing, giant books, that were 12 inches high, each one of them, all thin, small pages, small type. And he started quoting regulations about kerosene lamps in hallways and how they're still on our books. We've got to go make the case what this is doing to the American economy, and we need a president that's going to be supportive and a Senate and a Congress that's going to be supportive of getting rid of all this ridiculous regulations. And we got to also push back against the left who say, oh, you don't want clean air or clean water. Look, I want clean air, clean water. You do too. But there's a point where the regulations become absurd and actually become counterproductive to really being focused on the things that we want.
Yeah, you can use a light hand and make sure you protect people, because when you use the heavy hand, all you do is create tyranny. You've created a tyranny of a bureaucratic sector. It is a sector that operates almost without checks or balances from the government at this point, and that is un-American and it's unconstitutional. I want to talk about tax policy as well, though, because we're talking about things that actually interrupt the progress in this economy. One is our massive interest rate on our debt that right now is standing at a little bit north of $450 billion a year, and that could go up if we're downgraded. And it probably will happen that goes up because we're downgraded. We've got massive loss of wealth in the average American family. We've got a regulatory nightmare. We've also got tax policy that could, honestly, I always dare people to do this. Call up the IRS, ask them a question. Wait 10 minutes, call again. You'll get a different person, ask them the same question, see if you get the same answer. We got to do something about this.
Look, our tax code is a disgrace to the American public. We spend, it's estimated, anywhere from $160 to $300 billion a year in preparing our taxes. We have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, higher than self-proclaimed socialist countries like Sweden or France or Italy, higher than any Latin American country, higher than any Asian country. Communist China's corporate tax rate's 25%. Ours is 35%. We also have a tax code that is littered with special loopholes, cronyism at its worst, where giant corporations are able to buy off career politicians so they get taxed at a fraction of what small business. And what that does is small and medium-sized business, which are job engines, how can they compete when they're paying 2 or 3 or 4 times the tax rate as a giant company that has access to Washington politicians? You can't. So my view, lower the corporate tax rate, get rid of all the loopholes. On the individual side, get rid of 6 brackets, boil it down to 2, simplify it. And most Americans should be able to fill out their taxes on a postcard. I mean, can you imagine that? Okay, here's what I make. Here's, a couple basic, deductions. Here's what I owe you or you owe me back. I mean, it's so simple. Instead, we have 92,000 people in our Internal Revenue Service. It is tyranny.
Well, and when you call them, you don't get the same answer, and I know this is true because I've done it. I've proved this to myself. You get told different things. You can't understand a tax code that if you stack it up actually reaches to the top of the Capitol Tower. You can't understand that. So clearly, there's problems. Throw it out. I like the idea of simplifying it. Look, you've got some very near and dear deductions, though. And, those are the kinds of problems that Republicans simply don't want to be honest about, is that some of the deductions that you would have to propose getting rid of are kind of popular.
Yeah, but look, this is a time we're in a real crisis, and there's no better way to create economic growth than simplifying our tax code. I mean, again, whether we spend 160 or 300 billion, take 160 billion. That's 1% a year of an economic drag just preparing our taxes. Again, if we got the highest corporate tax rate in the world, why are you going to build a plant here in the United States versus Canada, where Harper, who's a free market guy, is trying to drive Canada's corporate tax rate below 20%? So think of it. If you're a person thinking of making a $10 million investment and building a plant, are you going to do it in Wisconsin, or are you going to move up over the Canadian border and be taxed at, almost half the rate?
Well, I mean, they're working in Canada. They're trying to pull it down to 15% if they can get any support for it.
Yeah.
To try and what you've seen is the Canadian economic growth improve. You've seen their unemployment rate go down as they have begun tax reform. If you can believe it, we should follow Canada. As they've begun their tax reform, they have seen very quick turnarounds in some key segments of their economy. And this is a country that we like to make fun of from time to time.
Absolutely. I mean, if people want to understand why a lot of jobs have been offshored to China all over the world, look at our tax system. When you have the highest corporate tax rate in the world, you're driving business to invest overseas or over our borders. It's time to make a competitive tax rate, simplify it, and get rid of all the crazy loopholes. And, that will create a huge economic engine for our economy.
Yeah, the Democrats say that what we should really do is pass the Buffett rule, and we should punish those people who create jobs overseas to avoid the tax liabilities in the United States, and that's a better answer to our problems. Yeah,
well, that's the biggest phony thing, too, because they say it's going to help our deficit, and yet it does. It doesn't even affect less than 0.5% of our deficit by enacting the Buffett rule. And then all you're going to do is squeeze private capital formation even more and drive it out of the United States. Again, these are all talking points. It's all trying to play class warfare, even though, let me also deal with one of my economic points, get rid of cronyism, which this president has brought so much into our free market system, where they're trying to pick winners and losers. Think of Solyndra, where George Kaiser gave President Obama a big campaign check. President Obama signs off on a $500 million loan guarantee. 2.5 years later, Solyndra goes bankrupt. We're all left with a $500 million loss as taxpayers. He still has a campaign check. This is cronyism. And so much of this president, he comes and plays class warfare, but behind the scenes he's doing something totally else. Wall Street's the prime example. Tim Geithner, his Treasury Secretary, was the head of the New York Fed overseeing the Wall Street banks when they're ripping off the American public, and yet he's the one sitting there trying to play class warfare. It's absurd. He's a complete hypocrite as far as I'm concerned.
Eric, where can people find, looking at my clock here, going to run out of time, where can people find more information on the plan? We've covered quite a bit of your plan, actually, on the program so far, so where can people find more if they want to download it?
ericforsenate.com. We're going to be launching a web video this week that talks about all the 8 points, and then each week we're going to lay out a detailed discussion on each one of the individual points and giving people data so they can go out and talk to the people in the middle, because we got to pull this middle over to our side.
Appreciate the time, Eric Hovde, on the program, and it's Eric for Senate. That's Eric with a C, for Senate.com. Thanks very much. Appreciate the time.
Thanks, Vicki. You're the best.
All right. Take care.
Bye.
Eric Hovde. And folks, because I'm getting people saying, well, are you going to put Tommy on? Yeah, I made a contact. We're going to try to get all the U.S. Senate candidates on the program. I just love Eric. I just think he's fabulous. EricForSenate.com. We do, actually, no, we're out of time. Have a great day, guys. See you tomorrow.